Good morning, everyone. In the previous session, we were discussing about various approaches for recovery and purification of fermentation products, especially with reference to the bioproduction of ethanol from fermentation broth. And among the various approaches, at the end of the session, we were discussing about gas stripping, which is one among the separation techniques to remove the components by the dissolution of the mixture into a gas which is passed through the fermentation broth. So in this session, we will continue our discussion on recovery and purification of ethanol from fermentation broth. Later, we will be trying to understand the bioproduction of citric acid. So as I said, the gas stripping is one among the separation technique to remove the components by the dissolution of the mixture into a gas phase. Now this gas phase which is passing through the fermentation broth. So when you try to integrate, that is during the integration of the gas stripping process and the fermentation process, the increase in stripping factor leads to an increase in number one, the density of the cell, consumption of the substrate, an improvement in production of ethanol, and most important one, the limitation of inhibitory effect of the product by itself, that is ethanol. So in the gas stripping approach for production of ethanol, the integration of gas stripping process and the fermentation process, the increase in the stripping factor leads to an increase in number one, the cell density or the concentration. Number two, substrate consumption. So naturally you will have higher yield of the ethanol. Number three, an improvement in ethanol productivity, that is good yield of the product. And number four, limitation of ethanol acting as an inhibitor during the process of fermentation. Because we have studied in our previous session, ethanol acts as an inhibitor in the process of fermentation when the concentration of ethanol is about 20% by weight. So to avoid ethanol being an inhibitor, an approach should be developed, and gas stripping is one such separation technique where there is limitation of ethanol inhibitory effect. Then we have air, carbon dioxide and pure nitrogen, which are most commonly used gases in the gas stripping separation technique. Right. Besides the nature of the gas, because we are discussing about gas stripping separation technique, so naturally the limiting factor will be the nature of the gas that is being used for the separation technique. So besides the nature of the gas, other operating conditions have been reported to affect the gas stripping performance. Obviously, it will be the nature of the gas which is a limitation factor. Besides the nature of the gas, there are other operating conditions that are shown to affect the gas stripping performance. Among the other operating conditions, number one, the feed temperature. Number two, the stripping gas temperature. Number 3, the specific stripping gas flow rate. And number 4, liquid height to column diameter ratio. That is height to the diameter ratio of the vessel which contains the liquid or the fermentation broth. So the other operating conditions which have been reported to affect the gas stripping performances are the feed temperature, stripping gas temperature, specific stripping gas flow rate, and the liquid height to column diameter ratio. So these are other operating conditions besides the nature of the gas which are reported to affect the gas stripping performance. So moving on to the next approach is the vacuum fermentation. This technique, that is vacuum fermentation, was developed to limit the ethanol inhibitory effect. The sole purpose of developing vacuum fermentation for ethanol bioproduction is to limit the ethanol inhibitory effect, because this is the major concern in ethanol production industry, because about 20% of weight of ethanol in the fermentation broth, it becomes an inhibitor which leads to the production of ethanol not up to the yield that is expected. So you should have a technique which limits the ethanol inhibitory effect. So vacuum fermentation was developed keeping in mind to limit the ethanol inhibitory effect during the fermentation process. So what is happening in vacuum fermentation? During vacuum fermentation process, the bioethanol is continuously recovered from the broth. How the bioethanol is continuously recovered? By applying a vacuum pressure. So that the ethanol may evaporate at the fermentation temperature. So a temperature is maintained for easy evaporation of the ethanol, and then after evaporation it is subsequently condensed using a condensation cooling system or chilling water. So it is a continuous process, right? So bioethanol is continuously recovered from the fermentation broth by applying a vacuum pressure, so that the ethanol may evaporate and then it is subsequently condensed using condensation cooling system, right? So during the vacuum fermentation system, you can control even when the ethanol concentration is less than 20% by weight, because you are continuously extracting the ethanol. As soon as you monitor that the ethanol production is reaching to the maximum of 20% by weight, so that you can immediately control the production of ethanol. So this is one important technique which is solely developed to limit the ethanol inhibitory effect. So if you reduce the vacuum pressure, if you stop the vacuum pressure, the ethanol extraction will be stopped. So if you feel that it is nearing to 20% by weight, so drop down the vacuum pressure. Right. So this limits or minimizes the inhibition effect of ethanol on the yeast metabolism, or the organism which is producing the ethanol and the fermentation process. Right. And this technique implies some practical limitations. Number one, requirements of high energy to maintain the vacuum. So the amount of energy required is very, very high to maintain the vacuum pressure. The need to high working volumes of the fermenters. That means the vessels should be very big enough. So that again is a practical limitation to use the technique, because if you are working on larger volume vessels, you require higher vacuum pressure. Higher vacuum pressure means much more high energy requirements. So this poses a practical limitation for vacuum fermentation technique. So the approaches doesn't stop over there. We have adsorption. It is an innovative ethanol recovery technique. Here we use something called as adsorbent, a porous adsorbent. Now the pore size is very much similar to the molecular size of the ethanol. So this is an innovative ethanol recovery technique from the fermentation broth using a porous adsorbent. The pore size of the adsorbent is similar to the molecular size of the ethanol. Now what is happening in this separation technique? The fermentation broth, it is passed through a bed packed with the adsorbent. Right? That means the fermentation broth is passed through an adsorbent, a bed packed with an adsorbent, and then the effluent is recycled back to the fermentation vessel. So this technique essentially involves two major steps. Number one, adsorption followed by desorption. So the ethanol or the product first gets adsorbed to an adsorbent, and in the second step you have to desorb whatever the ethanol that has been adsorbed to an adsorbent. Right? That means there is adsorption followed by desorption of the product. So adsorption onto the adsorbent and desorption from the adsorbent. So adsorption followed by desorption to recover a concentrated ethanol solution. And the second step is regenerating the adsorbent. So making use of the adsorbent for several cycles. So what is essentially happening in adsorption technique in bioethanol production? The fermentation broth is passed through a bed packed with adsorbent, and the effluent is recycled back to the fermentation broth. Now the adsorption is followed by a process of desorption, so that what is happening in this adsorption followed by desorption, you are trying to essentially recover the concentrated ethanol solution. And second most important is regenerating the adsorbent. If you see this schematic illustration, you can easily understand. We have the fermentation broth, and then we have a packed bed adsorber given in the pink color, and there is a recycle pump so that effluent is recycled back to the fermentation broth. And now this packed bed adsorber, through a heat treatment, the desorption of the ethanol takes place, and it is vacuum concentrated under cold trap, and again the solvent is recycled back. Right. So some criteria must be taken into consideration when you are trying to choose a suitable adsorbent material. So what is happening? The ethanol is binding to the adsorbent and then you are recovering from the adsorbent, that is by a process called desorption. Now the critical component in adsorption technique is the adsorbent, the material. So some of the criteria, so the material should meet some of the criteria. So what are those criteria? The criteria that must be taken into consideration to select a suitable adsorbent material. Number one, the selectivity. The sorbent or the adsorbent what you are choosing should have high adsorption selectivity of ethanol. So it should show selectivity towards ethanol compared to the water and other compounds such as glucose present in the fermentation broth. The sorbent should have high adsorption selectivity for ethanol compared to water and glucose adsorption. And number two, desorption. The ethanol desorption must take place at lower temperature compared to the adsorption temperature. So less energy is invested upon the recovery process from the sorbent. And number three, the equilibrium between the adsorption and desorption must be reached very quickly, fairly quickly. Right? It should not take long time to get adsorbed onto the adsorbent and to get desorbed from the adsorbent. So the equilibrium between adsorption and desorption should be fairly quickly so as to minimize the contact time requirements with the gas or with the fermentation broth. Right? So selectivity, desorption and the adsorption desorption equilibrium are the most important criteria that must be taken into consideration to select or to choose the best possible or suitable adsorbent material if you are using the adsorption technique for ethanol bioproduction. So next method we have solvent extraction. It is an alternative system which combines the ethanol fermentation and a separation unit which operates through solvent extraction process. That means this technique involves a plug flow reactor and liquid extraction system so that you can continuously extract the ethanol from the fermentation broth. So this is an alternative technique which is an integration of a plug flow reactor and liquid extraction system to continuously extract the ethanol from the fermentation broth. So what is happening in this technique? The technique, that is liquid extraction process, during this process the fermentation broth is recycled through an extraction unit and then the concentrated product is recovered and the fermentation broth and the solvent are transferred to the fermenter. Right. So during this process of liquid extraction, the fermentation broth is recycled through an extraction unit and the concentrated product is recovered and both the fermentation broth and the solvent are transferred to the fermenter. So you can easily understand through this schemate. You see the fermentation broth, and there is a decanter wherein you can decant the aqueous phase. It goes to the wastewater treatment or the downstream process. And then we have a solvent phase which goes through a flash unit, and the solvent is recovered back and you can concentrate the ethanol. Right. So what are the important conditions for a successful liquid extraction of ethanol from fermentation broth? So there is a 7-point criteria for a successful liquid extraction of ethanol. Number 1, a great separation factor of ethanol. So separation factor is very, very important. Number 2, high ability of ethanol absorption to reduce the extractant solvent use. Number 3, low solvent solubility in the water so as to avoid the loss of the solvent. Number 4, existence difference in density between the aqueous phase and the organic phase so as to ease the separation very fast. Chemical stability. Number 6, an effective technique for ethanol recovery and recycle of the extractant solvent. Number 7, the solvent should not have toxic or inhibitory effect on the organism, that is yeast growth and the metabolism. So these are the 7 important conditions or the factors that are a must for a successful liquid extraction of ethanol. Right. So we have been seeing several approaches for bioethanol production. In the industries, even today, purification is mainly done by the process of distillation. For 2 simple reasons. High separation capacity of ethanol, and number 2, the simplicity of the application. More than 40% of the industries even today, they use distillation as purification of ethanol. It is still an effective and favorable separation technique for the ethanol production. For the reason, number 1, high separation capacity of ethanol, and number 2, the simplicity of the application. So with this, we have understood various approaches along with the distillation and refinement in the approaches for the bioethanol production at industry level. Now we will move on to another product, the most important product, the citric acid. That is the bioproduction of citric acid and its applications. Citric acid is a weak organic tricarboxylic acid with a molecular formula C6H8O7, and it is found in citrus fruits. To name the citrus fruits are the lemons, oranges, and so on. So these are the fruits which contain sufficient amount of citric acid, and synonymously they are called as acid fruits. So it is a natural constituent. That is, citric acid is a natural constituent and metabolite of plants and animals, and it is versatile and widely used organic acid in the field of food and pharma industries. And we have seen, and there are a lot of literature stating the citric acid used as a good preservative, and citric acid can be easily manufactured because it is easily soluble. Whenever we are trying to manufacture a product, the solubility of the product is very, very important. If the product is soluble, then any method you develop to recover the product from the medium becomes easy. Right? From the industry point of view, citric acid as non-allowed non-synthetic. It is classified as non-allowed non-synthetic under the annotation acids. Non-allowed non-synthetic under the annotation acid. That means we have to produce the citric acid by microbial fermentation of carbohydrate sources. Right. So citric acid has been called as a non-allowed non-synthetic under the annotation acids that must be produced by microbial fermentation of carbohydrate sources. So in olden days, citric acid was produced by three methods. Number one, extraction from the acid fruits or the citrus fruits. Number two, chemical synthesis. And number three, fermentation. So these are the three methods that were in practice for the production of citric acid. Recently, wide range of production methods of citric acid has been reported. And if you just look at the statistics of the citrus fruit production in the world, India ranks 6th among other countries in the production of citrus fruits in the world. So we have ample opportunities to produce the citric acid. If you look at the history of the citric acid, it was in 1784 when Professor Scheele, where he isolated the citric acid from the lemon juice as calcium citrate. And then in 1893, Weimar was the first to observe the presence of citric acid produced by a microorganism, that is Penicillium glaucum. And in 1934, through the X-ray diffraction studies, the structure of the citric acid was revealed. So, the citric acid play a central role in the biochemical cycle. So with this, I'll stop my today's session over here. We will continue our discussion in the next session. Thank you very much.